guess it's time to get going with the program. Our speaker tonight, I remember when he was a brand new faculty member at UWSP and how enthusiastic he was and how eager he was to get going. And 26 years later, he's still enthusiastic and eager to get going. Eric got his bachelor's degree from Michigan State University, master's and doctorate from Colorado State, all in wildlife. During his career at Stevens Point, you can't even count the number of teaching awards that he has. It's something like 6 of them: College of Natural Resources, Outstanding Teacher, UW Stevens Point Excellence in Teaching, and UW System-Wide Teaching Excellence Awards. Over the years, many of us have heard him give enthusiastic, interesting presentations on cougars, wolves, bobcats, and his enthusiasm has always come through. I hope that our presentation tonight will not be a complete downer, and Eric assured me that it won't be, but it's not the usual enthusiastic, optimistic kind of a program that we might have. We're dealing with real things in our world. Eric Anderson.
Thank you, Greg. Well, that's far more of an introduction than I deserve. But I did ask Dan Menzel in the back. Dan, could you just stand up for half a second here? So I asked Dan Menzel to collect all sharp objects from you. Because I'm afraid the topic we're dealing with tonight is not the most upbeat issue to deal with. However, the fact that you're here to hear about it, learn about it, to me is the best thing we got going for ourselves. So that's where I want to leave it, and we'll see where we go from here. So, and if I can get the lights, that would be just great.
How's the volume? Can you hear in the back?
Yeah. Is the mic working, or is it not really working? We'll see how the voice holds out.
Let's crank it up a little.
Crank it up a little.
How's that? How's that?
Are we
I
getting
don't think
it?
it's on.
Yeah.
Is it on?
It's not on.
Mary, can I count on you to raise your hand if you can't hear me? Good. Excellent. I appreciate that a lot.
Let's see if we can get these. Is that okay?
Perfect. I had the incredible opportunity a couple of months ago to spend 5 weeks exploring Western Australia. And the place I want to take you is right here on the map. It's called Shark Bay, and down at the base of that bay is a place called Hamlin Pools. That is the reason I went to Australia. And I was expecting to find it to be quite the tourist attraction. But it turned out to be at the end of a very long, deserted road, and it ended with this little zigzaggy boardwalk that goes out into the water about 100 feet or so. Nobody there, very little signs. It was like, this is the greatest thing in Australia, and there's nobody here, and people don't go here. Turns out that along this boardwalk here is one of the few places on the planet Earth that this mat of microbes live. Primarily cyanobacteria, it's all one-celled organisms, and that's the material that has been on the planet Earth for about 3.5 billion years. It's the first forms of life that we had here on the planet. And if you sit there long enough and watch, every so often you'll see a bubble of oxygen come up to the surface of the water and dissipate. When these organisms got started, we lived in an anaerobic Earth, a place where there were no oxygen-breathing organisms. These mats, known as stromatolites, that build up year after year after year, produce the oxygen over billions of years that ultimately got us to a point where we could have a huge explosion in the kinds of diversity of life on the planet. So if you want to take a look at this graph for just a second here, you'll notice that about 560 or 70 million years ago, all of a sudden, life got started. It was out here for 3 billion years, but about 500 to 600 million years ago, all of a sudden, life began to diversify, and it exploded with trilobites and all sorts of other forms of organisms. What you'll notice also from this graph here is that there have been a few punctuated points where we've lost biological diversity, but where we stand right now is more biological diversity than we've ever had on the planet Earth in terms of the number of different kinds of species that exist out here. So if we look at all these 5 other points where we've lost biological diversity, the interesting thing about those 5 other points is that usually there was some kind of environmental significant change environmentally that led to a significant loss of biological diversity. The one we know the most about was the end of the age of dinosaurs. And there was an article published just 2 days ago that talked about this asteroid impact. This asteroid is only 10 miles across, but because of where it landed, which was just off the Yucatan Peninsula and coming pretty much out of the south and heading up towards the north, it hit a soil type that was full of sulfur. That dispersed all sorts of clouds of sulfur into the atmosphere, as well as huge dust cloud that immediately cooled the Earth down. And what that did was it ended the age of these large species that had to get their warmth from the environment and gave rise to us as humans. Little did we know that the mammals that emerged from then would end up ultimately creating the last of those periods that we now find ourselves in. Now, we've lost other species before because of global volcanism. We've also had continents moving around that have changed the deck of playing cards and led to some mass extinctions that way. But what we're looking at right now is this last period, this 6th mass extinction that we sit on the verge of right now. And how this extinction is different than all the other ones, which were created by some kind of cataclysmic events or turmoil that's happened within the planet Earth. This is caused by one entity, one biological entity, and that is the human species. We're entering into a period that's known as the Anthropocene, and there are some people that say the Anthropocene started in the Industrial Revolution, when we really got hold of technology and began to make rapid changes in our environment, and our populations began to surge at that particular point in time. However, if we look back a little bit further, we find that human impact on the planet Earth didn't start with the Industrial Revolution. It actually predated that. If you go back to the end of the last glaciation period here in Wisconsin, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, you'll see that we had some of the most bizarre creatures running around here. We had woolly mammoths, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and mastodons, but we had this giant 3-toed sloth that was 8 feet tall. We had beaver that were 6 feet tall. And of course we had the predators that fed on those things as well, like the saber-toothed tiger. All of those species disappeared in a heartbeat of the planet, a very, very short period of time. What's interesting about that is 35 different genera, or about 70-some different species, disappeared in North America in a very short period of time. Interestingly enough, didn't happen anywhere else. Didn't happen in Europe, didn't happen in Australia, didn't happen anywhere else at that exact time. So what was it about North America 10 to 12,000 years ago? Well, that's about the time that humans in large numbers got into the North American continent and exploded across it, and probably ultimately acted as a super predator on the landscape and added one more form of mortality to a lot of these large critters that ultimately led to the demise of them and the extinction of them. So we can't take credit in the last 100 years or so for being the devastation machine of the planet's biota. We've been doing it actually for quite a long time here, and particularly with this large megafaunal things. Now, real quickly, I don't want to make this a university lecture, but we know only a fraction of the organisms that live on planet Earth right now. We've identified about 1.35 million of those species. And if you look at this pie chart right here, you'll see that the majority of what we've identified so far are insects. And it turns out that out of those insects, about 63% are arthropods, but 25% of all the things that are living on the planet Earth are beetles. So if you took all the organisms that lived on planet Earth, put them in a brown paper bag and shook them all up, stuck your hand in there, you'd have a 1 in 4 chance of pulling out a beetle. Okay. And there was a scientist who had studied this and realized this back in the latter part of the last century. He was asked by some theologians to tell them, what can you tell us about God the Creator by having studied His creations for so long? And he knew this was a trap that had been set by them, and he kind of rubs his chin for just a moment. He looks out at the rest of me and says, I believe God has an inordinate fondness for beetles, which was the perfect answer to give, and absolutely truthful, but didn't get into that whole evolution issue there at all. So, the majority of things on the planet Earth that we know of so far, 1.35 million of them, and most of them are insects. Now, this gets a little crazy, because we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know yet. Which is, how many more are there of things that we need to figure out that we have on this planet Earth? And if you take a look at this diagram here, this is our best guesses in the green for the species that we still have yet to discover. What you may want to notice is this, is first off, the insects only go to about 1 million. We suspect that there are probably somewhere close to 5 to 8 million of them. So I'm over here in the next room trying to show you the end of that graph. Fungi, spiders, we're just beginning to find those things. And folks, it's not all in the tropics. There is stuff we're finding every day here in North America. We started a project down in the Great Smoky Mountains. We found over 1,000 new species unrecorded in science just right here in our backyard. So there are a lot of species out there that we still haven't identified yet out there. So the question becomes this: what are we losing in terms of species, and how fast are we losing those? And then you have to ask the ancillary question, which is, if we don't even know how many we have out there, how do we know how many we're losing? Well, that's where we're going to try to explain to you what we use for logic in terms of figuring this out. But we don't have hard and fast numbers for how many species we're losing due to human influence on things. There are some species we obviously know that we did in. Passenger pigeon is the classic example, and I know last year there was a speaker who came in and talked just about passenger pigeon. But we went from having 1 in every 4 birds in North America being a passenger pigeon to having absolutely none of them by 1914. The last bird died in captivity in the Cincinnati Zoo back in 1914. And of course, Babcock, I don't know, how many of you have ever stopped in Babcock and seen that sign there for the last passenger pigeon that was shot? Anybody? No. It's not the reason people come to Wisconsin. It's kind of a downer, but it also represents the fact that this was a huge bird that nobody thought could go extinct, and we managed to do it by over-harvesting of this species. Another classic tale is of the world's largest pigeon, which you probably know as the dodo bird, which was a flightless bird, restricted to an island, and with the advent of humans on that island, it was a very short period of time before they were made extinct in that region. So the dodo bird and the passenger pigeons are just a couple of examples of species we know that humans have been responsible for going extinct out there. We know, based on historical records that we've lost at least 500 species in the last 100 years. That's of species we had named and followed. If you included all the new species that we're discovering, we really don't know how fast those are going extinct. We don't have a good handle on that at all. But when we put all these pieces of the puzzle together and compare it with historically what was lost before humans showed up, based on what our fossil records show us, is that we are losing species probably in the vicinity about 100 times faster than the natural background rate of extinction due to the presence of humans and the variety of activities that they're engaged in out there. Now, I promise not to get mathematical on you, but this is an insight into how we know how many species we're losing. What you need to understand first off is that we've known for a long time about something called the species area relationship. And that is that the more area you have, the more different kinds of species it will support. But you notice it's not a linear straight line here, it's a curvilinear. So it means that if you lose half of your area, you don't lose half of your species, you only lose a few of them until you start getting down here to these very small regions. When you cut them in half, you may in fact lose half of your species. We first learned this about islands, but we've since discovered it applies to hunks of habitat as well. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the most species-rich habitat terrestrially that we know about. The tropical rainforests cover about 7% of the planet Earth in terms of the terrestrial surface, and yet 50% of all species all terrestrial species may inhabit those tropical rainforests. We have satellites that allow us to keep track of the loss of the tropics every year, and on average we're losing about a little over 0.5%, which doesn't seem like a whole lot. But come back and look at this graph here. If this number up here is 8 million and you start ratcheting it back even just a small amount, you're losing a phenomenal number of species. So based on this well-proven species area relationship, it translates into estimates of about 18,000 species being lost every year just in tropical areas alone. So what does that mean for today? Well, we've got this other information that's going on. We've been tracking a lot of species that we have identified, and we're not only tracking them, we're finding out where they are in terms of how close to that edge of extinction they're falling. And what we're discovering is this. There's an organization called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they go out to all these different taxonomic groups, and they get the best scientists doing research on all of those, and they put them into a category of endangered, critically endangered, threatened, or least concern. What they discovered is 13% of our birds, as of right now, are threatened with extinction. If we look at our mammals, it's a quarter of our mammals that are there. Oh, by the way, what's this?
Condor.
California condor, yeah, which, folks, might be one of those species that's on the way out, despite our best efforts on trying to save it. The rhino, of course, 5 different species of rhino, several of which are critically endangered there, but a quarter of all the mammals are at risk out there. If we look at our amphibians, this happens to be the California red-legged frog, in a lot of trouble. And a third of amphibians right now are at a world of risk. And if you go one step further and start looking at plants, based on the IUCN data, more than half of the plants live in a threatened existence. So these species, the western fringed orchid, prairie orchid, most likely won't be around when your children, your grandchildren are grown up. So one thing I have to mention, and that is that we've known for a long time that rarity is the very best predictor of extinction. So the rarer a species is, the more likely it is to go extinct. Easy to think about. You know, if all the human beings were in this room at one time, it is possible that we could all come down with the flu, or a tornado could strike, or something could happen. We could all be wiped out at one moment. The human species would be done with. We are not all together in one room here. We're spread out across the planet, and there are lots of us. So the smaller the population becomes, the much more likely it is to go extinct. And that's one of the reasons we're so concerned right now. We've got so many species that sit on the edge, it's not possible for us to hold them all back from the brink of extinction. Oh, but what about zoos? Why not just get the Noah's Ark effect here and grab a couple species of, a couple individuals of each species and plop them into a zoo? Anybody know what's wrong with that theory? Okay, one of the things is we don't have a zoo big enough to keep track of all the possible species that exist on the planet Earth, the 8.9 million species that we think live here on the planet. So no facility is big enough. And there's a significant problem with 2 individuals of one species. Could you just look around the room for a minute? What 2 individuals would you choose to represent the human race? Okay? Would you give a test? Would you look at their DNA? How would you decide who it was going to be? We have so much diversity within all the species here. It's really tough to know exactly how we would try to save that diversity, not just the species itself, but the diversity within those species that are out there. So the zoos are not going to be an answer in the future. They can do a little bit. We have these things called frozen zoos, but even frozen zoos can't begin to capture the diversity of genetic material that we've got out there on the planet. But as you've probably seen, as I've alluded to in this, biological diversity is not just about the species, because species are the foundation for all sorts of ecosystem processes where the organisms are interacting with each other, they're interacting with the environment around them. So when you lose a species, you lose those critical ecosystem interactions that are going on. We call those interactions ecosystem services, things that functioning ecosystems give to us as human beings. So what are some of those things? And this is just a short list of a few of the things, but certainly providing us with oxygen is one of the things that they do, and purifying our water is one of the other things that a functioning ecosystem does. Certainly controls flooding in areas. It pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We'd be in a world more of hurt than we already are relative to climate change if we didn't have these biological processes that were pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere there. Certainly the decomposition of wastes. Just imagine walking through a forest where there were no decomposers. After about 5 or 6 seasons, you couldn't walk through those leaves because of the depth of that built-up waste. So recycling the nutrients as well as reusing that energy within those dead organisms is an important part of an ecosystem service that is being provided here. And then the whole idea of plants capturing sunlight, turning it into plant material and form of energy that allows us to have other species that live on that, and then species that live on those other species, and we get these pyramids of species that begin to build in as part of this ecosystem services being provided. So soil and vegetation generation and renewal, all that stuff is a function that is provided by ecosystems. Pollination of crops and natural vegetation, organisms that do that, is crucial because a lot of our vegetation has to have pollinators. I used to kid when I taught about summer jobs for students. If you wanted to get a job as an undergraduate, you could be given a toothpick or a Q-tip and go around and pollinate all these organisms that our native pollinators can no longer do because they're not around anymore. And even if you just did almond trees and pollinated those by hand, which we're actually doing now because of colony collapse disorder, it would be a huge and expensive process to do. All these things are being provided free by functioning ecosystems out there. Groundwater is a big issue here, and the recharge of that and the purification of water through wetlands is a really important, integral part of our human survival system out there. So the point I want to make is this. So we've talked so far about losing species, and if you remove species, you actually have the potential for really disrupting those ecological and ecosystem services that are being provided. Let's take a look at how that might possibly work. And I'm going to use a couple of examples, some of which I think you're familiar with and some that you may not be. But let's talk first about the wolves in Yellowstone. This is kind of an ecosystem service in reverse, because about at this point, about 85 years ago or so, about 90 years ago, we eliminated all the wolves from Yellowstone and most of the grizzly bears from Yellowstone. And when we did that, things began to change. But we weren't paying attention then. When we were paying attention is when we brought those wolves back in 1995 and started looking at the changes that happened within these ecosystems, and it's phenomenal what occurred. Let me give you one simple example of one thing that happened, and then we're going to multiply that by many score. So the gray wolves move into Yellowstone. They do very well there because there's abundant food, particularly elk. Elk now are being eaten by wolves, and not only that, elk, with the presence of wolves around, no longer are willing to walk out in the middle of the day to the middle of a Yellowstone meadow and start feeding on vegetation at the stream bank. They're spending the days up in the trees and away from that vegetation along the creek, which means that all of a sudden willow begins to grow up along those creeks again. And with the return of willow, you get several new species coming back. Beaver is one of them. Turns out there was one beaver in Yellowstone National Park when the wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now there are hundreds of them back in the ecosystem, primarily because of the regrowth of the vegetation along there. And McGillivray's warbler, which is a species that nests in willows along stream banks, also was significantly reduced in numbers. Their numbers skyrocketed when wolves were brought in. So nobody would have thought that bringing gray wolves back would have allowed us to have beaver again and allowed us to have the McGillivray warbler back in again. Since that time, we've done a number of studies and have looked at all sorts of different ecosystem impacts that have happened once wolves were brought back in. So what I'm asking you to do is, well, think about what happened when we brought wolves back, but think about what happens if wolves disappear. All these changes that we saw being undone are the changes that will be in place permanently if we lose that species on the landscape here. So elk reduced in numbers significantly. The aspen trees, which were dying out because they weren't regenerating, because the minute they stuck a little bit up, the elk mowed them back down again, are now starting to regenerate. And all the bird species and insects that are associated with aspens are coming back to the Yellowstone ecosystem. Coyote population plummeted by 50% because of the competition with wolves. You know what that's actually excellent for? It's excellent for Lyme disease. The reason for that is, with the coyote population reduced, you find that the fox population can increase. With the fox population increased, they are primarily feeders on small mammals. The number one carrier for the bacteria that causes Lyme disease is the white-footed mouse. And fox eat a lot of white-footed mice. So actually bringing wolves back into the ecosystem may in fact lead to a reduction in the Lyme disease incident here in Wisconsin. We're trying to ferret that out of the data right now, but it appears to have happened in several other locations where those small mammal populations have crashed. So we got all this riparian vegetation coming back as well with the beaver also there. And because the coyote population is reduced, the pronghorn population is now free to expand. And so their numbers have gotten much, much larger than they had been So, losing the wolves had a huge impact, and we saw that by working the equation backwards, by putting them back in and seeing what the impact was. The problem is, extinction is pretty permanent, and once it's gone, it's gone. We're not going to be able to turn the clock back by bringing back species. And although there is a movement called the de-extinction process, it is fraught with all sorts of problems. And you have to have good DNA, you have to have surrogate individuals, and as we'll see in a minute, there are problems about bringing a species back without bringing back its diseases, its predators, and its parasites. Okay, let's go to Isle Royale for just a minute, see how well you guys do. You guys probably know that out on Isle Royale, there is a healthy moose population. And in the 1940s, when the ice between Isle Royale and Ontario froze, at least 3 individuals got out, 3 wolf individuals got out on the island, and it's like they died and went to nirvana because there were moose everywhere to eat. It was just heaven. So they did so well all the way through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and their populations grew to a population of 50 individuals by 1980. Right now, as of April of this year, just last month, there are 2 individuals left on the island. So we're about to see that species wink out on the island. Okay, tell me, what's going to happen with that species gone, with that species extinct? Think broadly. Think about the Yellowstone ecosystem. What happened in Yellowstone when we took the wolves out of Yellowstone? Regeneration of some trees stopped, right? Aspen didn't regenerate. Have the same thing going on with balsam fir out on Isle Royale. What else happened? Yeah, right. Moose populations go sky high, eating what little vegetation there is there. And if their populations go high enough, they eat themselves out of house and home, their populations crash immediately. So we may see this huge cycling going on. Mary, do you know of any endangered plants out on Isle Royale? I don't mean to call you out here, but yeah, there are a number of endemic plants out on Isle Royale that are found there and only there. And the big concern is this, is with those moose populations going sky high, those endangered plant species may disappear off the island. So, question becomes, what are we going to do? Suggestions? Bring them in. That's been suggested. Most definitely bring some out there.
So how did the population drop to 2?
How did the population drop to 2? It's what we call the Noah's Ark effect. There are 3 individuals that founded the population. The genetic diversity in those 3 individuals was not great. So you had, after the first reproductive season, individuals that were brothers and sisters that had to mate with each other, or they had to mate with their mother, or they had to mate with their father, which is taboo in human society because it can lead to expression of all these deleterious genes. So we're finding disease resistance is very low, libido among the remaining individuals is very low, juvenile survivorship very low, so all sorts of things that are going to cause this population to wink out like that. So you guys may see it in the next year or 2. All it takes is 1 male, 1 female. All we got to do is lose 1, and it's all over. So we're eliminating species. Humans are eliminating species primarily 4 different ways: through the destruction of their habitat, through the introduction of invasive species, our overexploitation like we do with the passenger pigeon, harvesting too many of them, and through this newest change, which is that of climate change and the inability of a lot of organisms to keep up with the rate at which those things are happening. So rather than lecture to you about these things, I want to tell you some stories that will have as an example for these 4 different mechanisms and ways in which species are getting into a world of hurt. So let me give you some examples here. The first one is the Black-Footed Ferret. Black-Footed Ferret is a very rare weasel, lives in the western United States. It's affiliated exclusively with prairie dogs. And because that's primarily what it eats, it needs to live in prairie dog colonies. We lost this species once, or thought we had. We discovered it in 1981 after it had disappeared for what we thought was 6 years or so. We were fortunate enough to find it once again. But this is a story about habitat loss. So since they eat prairie dogs, and this black on this photo here indicates where prairie dog towns used to be, it's now been reduced by 98%. We have 2% of the prairie dog area that we had 150 years ago. So it's no wonder this species isn't surviving. Its habitat is gone. It's essentially, for them, turned into suburban areas outside of Denver and paved over, and we're still shooting, hunting, and poisoning prairie dogs, which is the food of the black-footed ferret. So we're headed towards more habitat loss and ultimately the loss of this species. I have a graduate student who worked on this for a number of years, and in the wee hours of the morning when we're out there spotlighting for ferrets, he'll stop and say, I don't think it's going to make it. Because this species is really at risk, and he's put a lifetime into it so far, and the chances of it surviving are very, very slim. So it's become one of the most endangered mammals in all of the world. There's about 300 of them left in the wild anyway. Okay, let's talk about invasive species for just 1 minute. How many of you have eaten at a McDonald's restaurant in other than the United States? Have you done that? Yeah, right. Because McDonald's is everywhere, right? That's what's happening to our planet Earth. It's the McDonaldization of the planet as we move species across these geographic boundaries, and we have this conveyor belt of constantly moving things, some intentionally, some unintentionally, to these new ecosystems. And what happens when we bring them along is something called demographic release. When they get to a new country, they don't have their predators, they don't have their diseases, and they don't have their parasites. And without those things, they have an incredible advantage over the other species that are there. So, let's talk about garlic mustard in that sense, okay? Garlic mustard, which I think many of you have already seen. It's a beautiful plant. We actually brought it here intentionally for medicinal purposes and culinary reasons to the United States. But once it got here, it just doesn't have the competition nor the disease, nor the parasites that keep it under control. And because of that, because it explodes in number, it reduces the diversity of plants in the understory of the forest. You can go from a forest having, perhaps a 75 to 100 different species of plants, down to a forest that has 50 or less species of plants in the understory on it. So because it's such a good competitor, really does well. It's also a member of the mustard family. And the mustard family produces fungicides. It produces chemicals off of their roots that kill fungus on the roots of other plants. Why is that a big deal? Because most of our tree species have to have sheaths of fungus growing on them in order to pick up the nutrients they need and protect them against attack by nematodes and other insects that might eat on them. So they exude this antifungal compound that means things like little sugar maple seedlings can't exist in a forest that has garlic mustard in it. They just are outcompeted by everything else because of this antifungal compound produced by garlic mustard. So invasive species have a huge impact on ecosystems. How about overexploitation? Well, we talked about the passenger pigeon, but we've got a more recent one right here in our backyard, so to speak, our global backyard here. There are, as I mentioned, 5 different rhino species, of which we have about a total population of 26,000. Most of them are in Africa. There's some in Asia. There's some in Java and several other island populations. but the sum total is about 26,000 of them. Those horns on the rhino are being exploited for a variety of different reasons. They are thought to have medicinal value, anti-cancer value, even though there's no scientific evidence that they do anything like that. But they also are big in status. If you can give a gift to somebody a powdered rhino horn, it means that you have made it big, particularly in some of the Asian countries, particularly Vietnam of late. That's become a real big thing. That's pushing this industry of harvesting these horns off the rhino. Interesting thing about these, they're essentially just made up of keratin. It's the stuff that your fingernails or hair are made up of, but it's all compressed together. So you could potentially cut it off without killing the animal, but that's very dangerous to do. So what most poachers do is they take that animal out and then they take a chainsaw and cut those off because they can do it quick. I show you this graphic just because for me it tells an incredible story. Look at how fast we've been poaching the rhino populations. This is just in South Africa alone. Doesn't include other locations around the globe where rhinos occur. Remember I said there are about 26,000 of them? Look at this, we're talking about harvest of more than 1,000 every year over the last 4 years. And when it takes 2 years for a young to be raised, and a single young at a time, their reproductive replacement rate is extremely slow. So the chances of them recovering with this kind of poaching going on is negligible. So we've got all these factors going on. Habitat loss, the impact of the overexploitation, we've got invasive species, and we have one final way in which we are losing species, and that is climate change. And the species I want to talk about relative to this is this little guy called the golden toad. This golden toad used to be what we call an explosive breeder. What would happen is, these are the males, very, very colorful. When conditions got right, all the males would come out. They'd get into these pools in one location in Costa Rica. They would have this promiscuous free-for-all, and they would end up getting a lot of reproduction out of that, and the species continued on. Well, the last time that explosive breeding happened was in 1987. And 1989 was the last time we saw a golden toad. I got to Costa Rica in 1992. They were still hopeful that they could find it lurking somewhere out there, but turns out that they were gone, and they've not been seen since that time period. So what was it that indicated climate change? All the factors point towards not only an El Nino year and an extremely long dry season, but one that was exacerbated by climate change. So it seems to be our first known victim of climate change in terms of total extinction caused by a human-induced change to the climate in which we are living here. Okay. I have to get my 25% of hopefulness in at the last few minutes here of this talk. And that is that the father of biological diversity, a gentleman by the name of E.O. Wilson, was acutely aware that we have to wake people up to the fact that we are destroying the very fabric that gave rise to us as a human species. We are the only species that has the ability to think forward and look at the impact of our actions. We are very good at doing that in a 3-month time frame or a 6-month time frame, or sometimes if we invest properly in stocks, it might even be a 5-year time frame. What we need to start doing is using that same intellect, the same thing that gave rise to our ability to create this mass havoc in the first place, and apply it to the solution of that, to turn the clock back. And you know, if you listen carefully to what I had to say, there was example after example of times that we have been able to make some changes. Wolves back in Yellowstone, the idea of having captured up the last of the Black-Footed Ferrets, bred them in captivity, and then got them back out in the wild there. We can do it if we have the will and determination. And I have a sneaking hunch that humans, if they don't do this, are going to suffer the same fate that they're creating for all the other species on the planet, which ultimately is a shortened time frame on the planet. There is one very hopeful thing for me, and that is we've been talking about this for a while, and the evidence is mounting. We're beginning to see more and more is getting institutionalized in terms of our ability to be able to deal with this. So we're no longer asking the question of what's going to happen. We're asking, what are we going to do about it? And that's where we need to put our emphasis. If all of that fails, we can go back to Hamlin Pools at the Shark Bay in Australia and allow those stromatolites that gave birth to the oxygen that allowed the planet to be full of the biological diversity that it has, and let them start over again. Just a long way to go until we get to the point where we're at right now. And I'd much rather stay where we are rather than having to turn the clock back and redo this whole 550 million years of growth out there. So, sorry about the bummer and a beautiful May afternoon, but hopefully out of that, you're motivated to try to do something and make some changes and make other people aware that this is a serious crisis. And it may be bigger in scope than any of the other little ones that include huge issues like climate change, huge issues like invasive species, huge issues like the destruction of habitat. All those things come together, and the payoff, the hurt, is in the loss of biological diversity. So with that, I'm done talking. Are there any questions? What are they going to do with Isle Royale? Most scientists, the guy who's been studying the wolves out there for the last 40 years, wants wolves to be reintroduced from Ontario. There's been some talk by the Park Service of doing that. However, I would like to see the experiment play out. It's a natural experiment. We don't know what's going to happen, and it's been going on long before we ever showed up on the planet here. So I think it'd be interesting for us to see this experiment play out, and then if we decide we want to bring wolves back in, fine. But you don't start the experiment and then go in and say, oh, well, we're going to change it now. So I'm hoping they'll do that. We'll see. We'll see what they do.
Did we have the ice bridge between Isle Royale and Ontario this last winter?
I don't believe we had last winter, but 2 winters ago we did.
I know 2 winters ago.
Yes, and we actually had one of the wolves exited the island instead of getting new wolves on the island. And then it got schmucked on the mainland, so it's not so good. So, other questions? Yes.
You asked about knowing the McDonald's in other places.
Yeah.
I have eaten in the McDonald's in Moscow in the old Soviet Union, and even more strangely, had eaten in a Pizza Hut on Red Square, and during the lunch looked across Red Square at Lenin's tomb while eating pizza. And even worse than that, I've eaten in a Colonel Sanders Kentucky Fried Chicken at the base of the Great Wall of China. And they had a full-size picture of Colonel Sanders standing.
And the sad thing is, you don't know how many small businesses went out of business because McDonald's moves in, and all of those things. Yeah, but right, exactly. It is the McDonaldization of the world. But that's that's quite the oxymoron of having them move in. Ironic.
Yep. I thought I'd give you a North American example of an aquatic species introduced to Europe. And the species is the one I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, which is the Opossum Shrimp Mysis relicta, which is natural in Lake Michigan and just a few lakes in Wisconsin, really deep lakes that have lake trout, for example. There aren't too many with lake trout that are inland lakes in Wisconsin. Well, anyway, you typically find them with this opossum shrimp. Well, they should have known better, but in Norway, the Institute for Nature Research hired me to come over there for 2 summers, and they had introduced a non-native species, this thing I'd written my dissertation on. But it's natural here and not natural there. So they did this to 9 lakes, and these are really deep lakes. And once they're in, it's almost impossible to get them out. So anyway, they thought, well, we'll hire this guy, me, to do the work to find out what they're eating in those lakes. And what it comes down to is Arctic char, which is in the family of trout and salmon, Salmonidae. That is a very prized fish and very, very popular among Norwegians. So I went in this lake with these other Norwegians that were good at speaking English with me, and we set up experiments and so on. And the gist of it is the little shrimp have evolved a behavior that they are down at the bottom of the lake in the daytime, and at sunset they come up and they feed in the mid-water and upper water depths where the juvenile and fry, the fingerlings and fry of this Arctic char are located. And then at right before sunrise they go back down in the morning. And you might say, well, why aren't they up there all the time? Well, it's real easy. The Arctic char would eat them gladly if they could see them. They're a visual predator. So anyway, the gist of it is, making this long story short, don't mess with native species if you don't know what you're doing as fisheries managers. That's the moral of this story. Don't mess with the system. Don't introduce exotic, non-native species when you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing in 1962 to 64 in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, California, Nevada. They introduced this, and they had kokanee salmon there, and they thought they'd grow better, and nope, everything backfired. And so what the moral of the story is, the people that live around all these lakes, they're like the people that hate the DNR in Wisconsin. These idiots! Why did they do this? The fishing's worse, the tourism's worse, everything's worse from a human perspective. So it just messed up the whole ecosystem because they're non-native species eating the food that these small fish, you have to have small fish before you have big fish. So the small fish weren't doing well.
Our hubris is remarkable.
So I thought I'd give you an aquatic example.
Yes, thank you very much. That's great. I think there are literally hundreds of examples like that where we thought we were doing something good and...
Yeah, they thought the fish would grow faster.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
just the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. Good point, very good point. Chris?
So, could I ask for a quick clarification, then I wanted to make a comment about the hopefulness of this. One is, you had said that the estimates of the rate of extinction are about 100 times the background rate.
Yes,
I've
correct.
typically heard 1,000. So am I reading the wrong things, or is there a lot of disagreement about what the rate relative to the background rate of extinction currently is?
Really does depend on what research you read. E.O. Wilson says we may be losing somewhere between 18 to 24,000 species every year. That means in the 45 minutes that I talked to you, we lost 4 or 5 species on the planet. The hard thing about that is you can't show carcasses. And people like to see carcasses. They like to know the species is the one that went extinct. But finding that kind of evidence is tough to do, Chris. So I took the conservative side, the 100 times the background rates, and even that is a little dicey because evolution, the way it works, is something called punctuated equilibria. And so you'll have these moments when all of a sudden a lot of species will go extinct and new ones will arise in a very short period of time, as opposed to slowly gradually evolving. So, yeah, it's tough to play with those, but I kept it simple and kept it conservative.
Yeah. The comment that I was going to make about the hopeful side of this is that one of the things that I have found really interesting is that in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, the social scientists have gotten really active in trying to sort of explore things that motivate people towards more pro-environmental behaviors. And one of the things that they have found over and over and over again is that some folks, Richard probably will recall this from a life presentation, but they found in sort of every study that they've done that people who feel more connected to nature behave more environmentally responsibly. And one of the really simple ways that people develop a sense of connection to nature is by spending time in it. And so in a room like this where I don't have children, but I imagine a lot of you do and you have grandkids, take them outside. I mean, it's a really powerful way that people develop stronger connections and sort of affective bonds. And those bonds make a huge difference in the ways that we behave.
Yeah.
So I think that's a sign of hope, actually.
I agree with you. Do you know how many of those studies have been done outside of the North American continent?
Lots, actually.
Lots,
yeah.
like Africa and Asia, and I mean, half the world population lives in Asia.
Yeah, some have been done in
Yeah.
Asia. I'm not sure so much about Africa.
Yeah, but no, I think you're absolutely right. I think if I look out at this audience, the reason most of you probably are here is because you've got that affinity for and have had those experiences with the natural world that have brought you along. And as you already mentioned, Chris, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys didn't need to hear this. I wish I could take Donald Trump and give that.
He would have understood a word.
Great news.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, I have a question about de-extinction.
Yes.
So would you kind of get basically what happens with invasive species?
Sure. Let me explain. When you de-extinct a species, let's say you want to bring the passenger pigeon back, which has been the big discussion point. They don't have enough ancient DNA to sequence the entire DNA genome, so they'll take, I think it's a band-tailed pigeon that they're trying to introgress these pieces into. You bring that species back, and you're not bringing back the lice that it carried, you're not bringing back the parasites intestinally that they were, that they succumbed to, and you're putting them back in an ecosystem that isn't the same from what they left. And, trying to de-extinct a species can be a lot like introducing a new invasive species into an ecosystem with unknown ramifications to it. So other people might disagree with me about the de-extinction thing, but I think we have to be so cautious with
Is that more the concern that they would have a huge impact on the environment, like an invasive species, or that they just wouldn't make it because they have diversity?
either side of the coin, because they're playing a different role now because the world has changed in which you're bringing them back into, or you may have just unleashed this thing that really doesn't have any controls on it numerically and has that release, demographic release. So scary. Yeah.
Yeah, I think GMO corn is a good example of that. Taking over the environment.
Yeah, I would. Are you guys familiar with Stephen Hawking? You know who Stephen Hawking is?
Years.
You would know him, maybe. He's he used to say that we're going to have to find a new planet to move to within 1,000 years. He's upped that to 100 years because of genetic engineering that we're doing, because of the threat of nuclear demise, and a number of other things that we're doing, climate change as well. So he's saying we're running out of time to find places to exit to. So
I wonder, is there some argument though that with genetic engineering that we're somehow undoing some of the things, mistakes that we've made, and can we reverse our, problems right now without any genetic
Yeah, the question was, can we reverse some of the problems that we've created without genetic tampering? We can fix some problems, but in the words of John Muir, you take a flower and you find that it's connected to the rest of the universe, and you just don't know sometimes. Fixing one problem can lead to, in terms of cascading issues elsewhere. So
Yeah.
if we're going to do that, I hope we do it judiciously.
Right, so I mean, with corn, it's, we're trying to feed all these people that we've got, and we're starting to kind of have like an agricultural crisis of sorts.
Yes,
And so you
right.
wonder, like people are like, well, we can't really be using all these pesticides because, and then they genetically modify, and so it's kind of like, how are we going to fix that?
Yeah,
So
right.
this is-
And once that genetic information gets introgressed into other species,
What
and,
will happen?
yeah, right. And very difficult to take that back out
Yeah.
again. Yeah.
One simple nuts and bolts thing that people can do every day is when you go buy a plant at the greenhouse, make sure it's not invasive, because if you look around town and the amount of autumn olive that's still here, the amount of burning bush, which is starting to spread into Iverson quite heavily. I mean, pretty much in the neighborhood I'm in, about 1 out of 10 houses has that. And even master gardeners, oh, it's so beautiful. Well, it doesn't matter. Purple loosestrife is beautiful. Get rid of it.
Yes. Yeah, very good point, Mark. Also, jumping worms. Those are a new visitor to Wisconsin. I picked them up in my garden because I collect 400 and 500 bags of leaves every fall, and I must have imported them with those bags of leaves from the Stevens Point area, but yeah, I sat my hands. It's not good. It's not good at all, but you're right. You've got to be very, very careful about that. But having said that, you can't stop every single thing you're doing and live life in a bubble. We, by the nature of being humans, are going to have an impact. We can't stop that. But you have the choice of whether that impact is going to be negative, neutral, or positive. And I think if you think about it, you can make your actions be as positive as you can, whenever you can. It's not about the exceptions, it's about the rules that you live by. So I would encourage you all, don't get discouraged about it. Do what you can and try to get other people to do what they can. And yeah, for the next 24 hours, just don't go buy a bath.
I was going to say, I suppose global warming has something to do with it as well, I suppose, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Global climate change is a game changer for all sorts of things that are happening. So.
On that note, thank you, Eric.